In this presentation, I'm going to go over some basics of qualitative data collection as well as qualitative sampling strategies. So this presentation, I'm drawing from the data collection chapter that you had a few weeks ago when we discussed quantitative data collection. As I mentioned previously, data collection method itself is applicable for both quant and qual research. What distinguishes the two approaches, though, is the nature of the data and data analysis. Therefore, I will draw from some pieces in the chapter that I think are very applicable to this discussion about qualitative data collection, as well as Miriam chapter that you were assigned to this week. I will also give you some tips from my own experiences doing qualitative research and qualitative data collection. So how would you go about collecting data for qualitative study? There are four means of data sources that people typically use for qualitative research. So first of all, probably the one that comes to mind for most of you and the focus of the Miriam's chapter is interviews. Basically, having conversations with participants in your study is a way of gathering data directly from each person. Another similar form is focus groups, and I will discuss the distinction between interviews and focus groups later in this presentation. But just remember that for now, the focus group is essentially collecting data from a group of participants in your study. Observation. So observation is a researcher going to a specific setting and observing his or her participants and observing a phenomenon in a natural setting. Again, I'll get into some specifics later on, but perhaps an observation study can be you going to the union and observing how students from various racial backgrounds interact with one another and where they sit, how they seem to be interacting with people of different and or same races and ethnicities. Finally, documents or visual data. They can be all different sorts of forms or physical or written or visual data that you collect from secondary sources or primary sources, such as meeting minutes from a board meeting, yearbooks, journals, and so on. We will have some specific examples of documents later in this presentation. One thing I would highlight here is that while the four sources are commonly used to collect data for qualitative studies, many qualitative studies draw from several of those different sources of data to really develop a rich understanding of the phenomenon or question of interest. For example, you do not need to necessarily say this study is going to only rely on focus group data, or this study will only rely on observational data. So when you develop your research proposal, maybe think about how you could draw from several of these different sources of data to study the phenomenon or questions that you are interested in. Okay, interviews. When you go to do an interview, you can do it in person or over the phone or over the computer, but in any case, it's really important to develop trust and rapport with the people who are participating in the interview with you. So interviews can actually be either quantitative or qualitative, right? So what would be a quantitative interview look like? Essentially, you would have a standardized set of questions that are all closed-ended. So the respondents would have to pick the responses from the options that you gave to them, and you wouldn't have give them any opportunity to really expand on their thought. So the interview will look pretty much like a questionnaire, but the interviewer is reading questions to the interviewees, recording their answers, and moving on. It's very much like a physical survey or quantitative survey instrument that the participant would fill out. But for whatever reason, the administrator chose to do it in person and just, read the questions, make people choose from the options. It becomes an interview form. So you have to distinguish it from the qualitative interviews that are based on open-ended questions. So Miriam explained that there are three major types of qualitative interviews. These are structured qualitative interviews, semi-structured interviews, and unstructured interviews. First, know that researchers develop protocol, which is a script to guide the interview process. You can imagine that you try to interview someone, and as you have conversation, you might forget important things that you're supposed to ask the person. Or there could be some unexpected event happen during the interview, or maybe some surprising responses come from your interviewee. Then it's easy for the interviewers, particularly for novice researchers, to be perplexed and forget how to continue your interview. So it is important to develop your protocol. Now, the types of the interviews will be dependent on how detailed your interview protocol is. Structured interviews are when your protocol has all open-ended questions that are fully worded and in a flow or order that you decided. So it is likely that the interviewer goes through the exact same questions for every single participant in the study, and you will not change almost any word that you use in the questions or your protocol. Some protocols even include follow-up questions projecting different scenarios in the interviewee's responses. So this is an example of structured interview protocol. As you can see, the researcher wrote up what he or she is going to tell the interviewee to explain the notion of informed consent and share critical details about the study. Then the protocol moves to the actual interview questions. So again, the order of the question is fixed, starting with the questions to get at basic background information. The protocol includes the big, expensive questions to stimulate participants' responses. And also, it provides probing questions. Semi-structured interview is more structured than just an informal conversation. The protocol has open-ended questions, as you can see in this example, that you will address during the interview. But the questions can be asked in any order during the interview. The interviewer can kind of change direction depending on how the participant is responding to their starting questions. And the wording also can be changed by the interviewer depending on how, again, the participant is responding to the questions. And then finally, unstructured or an informal conversational interview. This type of interview is very spontaneous and loosely structured, and there's really no interview protocol used. At least in my case, though, it's tough to have a completely unstructured conversation interview because sometimes it's hard to keep track of critical points addressed across all your subjects. And it's really hard sometimes to stay on track as you have conversation with an interviewee. And, keeping your subject or your participants on course with what you're looking for as an important thing to know. So what to think about when you are designing your qualitative interviews is that you have these trade-offs between flexibility and spontaneity in terms of the quality of your data and the ease of your analysis in the future. Typically, most of the interviews that I have participated in a study have been semi-structured. As Miriam discussed nicely in her chapter, the nice thing about semi-structured interview is that you can add probes or probing questions to reach clarity and gain more information about the topic at hand. The probes can sometimes help us to get at information that maybe won't be totally come out if you are just using a totally structured protocol. So usually I think it's best to go with, if you are going to use interviews, go with the semi-structured approach. So have questions formulated at hand, but you are ready with the main key points that you want to hit as an interviewer, keeping yourself organized. But don't lock yourself into saying, okay, these are the things I ask and that's it. And I'm not going to let the participants sort of guide the process. So the best practice for you might be go with semi-structured approach or maybe structured interview formats. In terms of constructing interview questions, you will need to avoid a one-word response such as yes or no questions and have an open-ended question that can invite any kind of responses. What you really want from your participants is a lot of just talking and information, so let them guide the conversation. Also, in addition to avoiding yes/no questions, you want to avoid academic jargon and confusing terminology that your participant might not totally understand. Of course, definitely do not use leading questions where the answers are embedded in the questions or questions that you are sort of like making a qualitative judgment about how the person will respond to your statement. Along the same lines, interpretive questions. You want to avoid putting words to the subject's mouth. After they respond, you want to say, so what you are saying is blah, blah, blah. But be careful when you are doing that. You want to let them respond, and whatever way they say or feel is accurate or adequate to represent their own experiences. Also, do not froze the word limit. This is more of a case if you are using a written format to collect your qualitative data. So for example, if you are asking respondents to describe their experiences with ASU's higher education program in 20 words, you're restricting your data that you are going to be able to collect. Again, always keep in your mind that qualitative research is to develop a really deep, rich understanding of a phenomenon. So you don't want to impose some sort of limit on economic reasons. If you want that kind of design, probably should be thinking about maybe more of a positivist or quantitative design rather than doing a qualitative design, right? So don't impose word limits or any other type of limit on your participants. Good qualitative interview take practice and in part hinges on constructing good questions. Again, it is nice to have a good set of questions in your semi or structured interviews in front of you that you can refer back to, especially if you are starting out as a new researcher. Good questions often start with asking people what, how, and why. Another good way of starting a qualitative interview is to tell people, tell me about your experiences. So tell me about your experiences as a first-year college student at ASU. Tell me about your experiences as a student advisor in your first year. This is a good way to start out your conversation with someone. Another good type of qualitative questions are the most important type of questions. For example, you can ask, what do you think are the most important problems facing higher education? Or what do you find most satisfying about your work as a professional administrator at ASU? Oftentimes, those questions get people thinking and talking. But of course, your interview question should be constructed piggybacking your research question. Here's an example from a study conducted by Stuber on white first-generation working-class freshmen's college experience. The research questions were more conceptual and summative. Now, the interview questions are developed to collect data that can provide answers to those research questions. Again, the questions are operationalizing the key concepts from the research questions. For example, the researcher asks their general experience, social life, activities, participation, feelings about campus, perception of the student about themselves. Also note that the way the researcher wrote the questions, she started with the tell me about question to open up the conversation and also mostly used what and how to invite students' responses without limitations. The other thing that I would mention is how many questions you should ask considering the length of the interview. So if you're conducting a semi-structured interview, I would say somewhere between 5 to 8 questions are a good range, but definitely no more than 10 items. Often, 5 questions go about a half-hour conversation to sometimes an hour. And if the conversation becomes too long, you might have difficulty holding your participants interested and making them talk about their idea in depth. Again, the important point is that you have to consider how you can best obtain candid responses from your participants in their description or talk. To improve the quality of interview, I will also advise you to pilot your interview protocol with a friend or colleague before you actually administer it to see whether or not the questions that you are asking are garnering the kind of rich, deep responses that you are looking for. Okay, so here are some more tips for effective interviews. First, interview is not a normal conversation, and your interview should be really focusing on let your participant doing most of the talking. So don't interrupt them and even avoid saying some interactive words such as yes, I see, and etc. Especially if you are going to be recording your interview, you want to get really good long direct cuts from it. And if you keep interrupting them, giving a direct quote is really difficult because you are keep disrupting them. You want to give your participant time to think and respond. Sometimes there might be awkward silences and pauses, and oftentimes your participants are just gathering their thoughts. So make sure that you sort of, take time and keep yourself at slow, moderated pace to let them have time to think and reflect on what you're asking. Prompts and follow-up questions are super helpful to really elicit deep information about what you are interested in studying. You can ask your interviewees to clarify some points or demand them more detailed description on particular dimension that they mentioned in the responses. Also, problem informants is a term for your participants who really don't give you good data. And just remember that it's inevitable. Some people are, for whatever reason, kind of more introverted or don't really are interested enough or have enough knowledge about the phenomenon at hand, and they are really not going to get great data. That would happen even sort of like those master interviewers or researchers, so don't feel that your interview is failed. But this is actually the reason why it's good to have several different interviewees in an interview study, because you want to collect a wide range of data and be able to sort of supplement those who might be problem informants and not give you good substantial responses. So how do you identify the exact perfect number of people to interview? So the idea is that you should try until you reach what's called saturation point in your study. Basically, you will have kind of baseline number of participants, usually 5 to 6 people. So you first interview them. If you keep getting new responses and totally different patterns in what different people tell you, then what you would do is keep interviewing more and more people until you reach a point where you feel like theoretically you've got a really good understanding of your topic and start seeing really coherent patterns from the responses. So that's the thing about qualitative research being flexible. The design you propose will give you an overall idea of what you want to do, but when you actually conduct a study, you need to be flexible and allow your design to evolve with what you are finding. So as you start collecting your data, maybe your interview protocol even will change midway or partway through your study if the questions you are asking are not getting responses that map onto whatever you are looking for. Focus groups are another way that you can collect qualitative data. So focus groups are essentially a group discussion of a particular topic of interest. Focus group is different from interview, even a group interview. But how? So let's say you have 5 people in the room and you ask each person individually to respond to the same question. That is group interview. Meanwhile, focus groups are discussion among the participants on particular issue rather than asking everybody in the room to respond to the same sets of questions individually. So why would we choose focus groups over interviews? Focus groups are especially effective when little is known about your topic. So typically, although they can be used at any stage of a research project, this method is most commonly used at the beginning stages. They're often used to develop an understanding of the phenomenon and then create a survey instrument and distribute it to a larger group. So oftentimes for mixed methodology studies, focus groups are very useful in informing collecting qualitative data to understand what's going on in terms of the phenomenon, and then use this information to create methodology for a quantitative phase of the study. So the advantage of part of focus groups are that interaction that is occurring among the participants can lead to more in different types of information than just doing an individual or group interview. Also, people can trigger one another and sort of thoughts about the phenomenon of interest. So that's the nice thing about focus groups. It really encourages discussion about a topic, and it's helpful for gathering wider opinions and beliefs and also attitudes about a topic and testing your assumptions. So typically, a focus group will have between 5 to 10 participants. Groups with less than 5 people tend to reveal less information. On the other hand, it's often difficult to have a good conversation with groups larger than 10 to 12. Also, if you are going to do a focus group, it's sometimes important to recruit a few extra people because oftentimes there can be no-shows, especially when it comes to college students. So I ran a couple of focus groups, and a lot of times, especially depending on the time of semester, like finals, you might not get everybody who committed to show up. Again, as with interviews, the number of focus groups that you end up running depends on the amount of information that you can gather. Sometimes studies use one focus group, and if you reach saturation from one focus group, that's good. But sometimes for more complex questions, you probably need more focus group. So while there's no real firm deadlines or guidelines in terms of the numbers of focus groups, most studies use at least 2 and usually no more than 4 focus groups. So I would say somewhere between 2 to 4 is the most common size in terms of one single study. In addition, of course, your participants should represent your population of interest. For example, if we were interested in understanding perspectives on some issues from students and faculty, we would do one focus group of students and one of faculty, and then compare their responses. But we probably wouldn't want to mix the 2 groups given what we were interested in from the beginning. In terms of moderating the focus group, it's oftentimes good that if the moderator is you, the researcher, and have someone else there to be taking notes. So it's hard sometimes to both facilitate and record notes on a focus group. So either recording it with a tape recorder or having someone there taking notes for you is so helpful if you are the researcher who is running the focus group for the first time. I uploaded a supplementary article about focus groups on Blackboard, so you may want to take a look at the article if you plan to collect your data using focus groups and want to learn from an example. Another way you can collect qualitative data is through observation. So essentially, my observation is when, as a researcher, observe participants in a natural or structured environment. This is called observation. So why do we not just interview people about their behavior, but observe people instead? The thing is that what people say they're doing or what their values are or what their behaviors are, not always what they actually do in practice. Observations give you an understanding of how people actually behave in a natural setting. So maybe when you ask people about how they interact with people of opposite races or ethnicities, they might just say that, some socially acceptable answers, such as, I have a lot of friends who are, from different race. However, when you actually observe them in practice, their behavior might not follow their description. To understand the way a phenomenon actually occurs, a qualitative researcher can be a complete participant, so full member of a group, and do not even tell people that you are a researcher, and they will think that you are just there participating along with them, and you are just like one of them. On a participant as observer model is that the participants know that you are a researcher, but you spend a lot of time with them, and you can immerse yourself in their practice or what's going on. And the reverse situation, or kind of a little bit different from the previous ones, would be observer as participants. So people know that you're a researcher and you sort of spend a limited amount of time actually participating with them, but more time is spent outside the group observing what they're doing. Finally, a complete observer would be when you observe just from the outside, or you even don't interact with your participants, but you also don't tell them that you are a researcher. On observation study, I will put it up on Blackboard in the supplementary section, but it was done by this researcher at Miami University in Ohio named Peter Golda. And what he did was he went on a campus tour, and he, with the other prospective students, were visiting campus and their parents on a tour, and observed how the tour guide and explained and described the university campus, and also how the other tour participants, so the prospective students and their parents, reacted to the way that the tour guide was presenting the campus. So if you're interested, find the article and read it. Another source of qualitative data can be from documents or visual data. So documents encompass both personal documents, from what people write or record for their own private purposes, or official documents. So personal documents can include letters, journals, and pictures. Nowadays, even one's social media activity can be a good source of data for personal information. On the other hand, researchers can also collect data from newspapers, annual reports, yearbooks, meeting minutes, or all other archives. In terms of the way that we do sampling in qualitative research is a lot different than quantitative research. Basically, the biggest point here is that we are not trying to make inferences, or we don't really care about generalizations as we did in the quantitative research. So sampling technique in qualitative research is more of a purposive sampling technique. And just as a side note, a lot of times in the past, qualitative researchers have used the term convenience sampling, and now that term is considered to be a little bit derogatory, like, hey, you're just convenient to me, so you can participate in my study. So we prefer using the term purposive because you use purposive samples rather than not being so concerned about the representative of your sample. Or, it's more important to highlight that you want to focus on the cases that are conceptually important to you. So this applies across the board. So all of your interviews, documents, observations, whatever should have some elements of importance related to your research question. Anyway, there are different ways you can purposely sample those related to your research question. First, you could do what's called maximum variation sampling. Basically, you want to select a wide range of participants or cases or even documents to reflect diverse characteristics in your data. Or maybe you want to monitor a sample, so you could select homogeneous participants. If you want to intensively study extreme cases, then you want to select the participants that are cases that represent extreme than any other individuals on whatever dimension you are interested in studying. On the other hand, maybe you want to try to identify a typical case, so the average participant in your phenomenon of interest. Sometimes qualitative researchers use critical case sampling, so they are selecting participants that are known to be important or sort of focus on the especially informative cases. Meanwhile, you can look out and select cases that might disconfirm your theory. So what you do is showing what is considered as common or typical cases and contrast them with cases that is sort of the exception to the rule. Researchers sometimes do opportunistic sampling, so cases come about as opportunities arises. For example, maybe because I'm at Arizona State University, I will recruit my participants from the Ira Fulton School of Engineering as I study engineering graduate students' career paths because opportunistically it's convenient to me. They're right there. Then mixed purposeful sampling. So this basically refers to when researchers in qualitative studies use a combination of those different sampling strategies. Again, there is no one way to pick participants in qualitative study. You want to think about what's the purpose of your study and how you want to sample participants or cases that fits best for your study. If you see a lot of different approaches that are attractive for your study, it's up to you with a qualitative researcher to define your sampling strategy that you think the best way to approach your topic. So those are just some basic sort of key aspects of qualitative research design and data collection that I think are important to highlight. Hopefully, they are supplementing what you read about in the Medium chapters, as well as my prior lecture. In the class, we'll definitely go through some data collection and sampling examples and scenarios from a qualitative approach. Also, we will continue spending some time on workshopping your research method, particularly this week for those of you that want to do a qualitative study. In addition, we will spend some time doing a practice interview because I'm feeling that a lot of you are going to use interview as a data collection method for your capstone project or future projects. And again, conducting a good interview is not an easy task because interview is different from just having a casual conversation with somebody. So hopefully the activities we are going to do in class will help to sort of reiterate some of those ideas around qualitative design and data collection. And I will have some time for you to ask me questions. So hopefully you will come prepared with any questions you have about the topics that I present. See you in the class.